had some technical difficulties, but finally we are on track. My name is Gaia Sunar, I'm an immigration lawyer, and I'm also an activist with the group Bostonbul. I'd like to briefly introduce you to our group. Something very strange happened in Turkey over the summer of 2013. Hundreds of thousands of people took out to the streets to protest, as most of you might have heard, under the Gezi protests, and it was to reclaim the last piece of green area in the middle of Istanbul, near Taksim Square. However, it was much more than that. Millions of people were frustrated with the increasing authoritarianism in the country, the increasing police brutality, and the human rights violations. And so simultaneously around the world, in many cities, including Boston, New York, Tokyo, LA, DC, London, these protests popped up. And here on June 1st, 2013, a group of almost 400 people came together in Boston Common to show solidarity with the protesters in Istanbul and in other cities. And since then, we kept organizing. The Gezi protests ended, but we continued to hold events, panels, documentary screenings, because we decided that it's our collective duty to show solidarity with the democracy struggle in Turkey that's still going on. Some of the events we've held were talks given by Raquel Dink. She's the founder of Hrant Dink Foundation, the widow of the Armenian journalist who was assassinated, Hrant Dink. Ahmet Shipkin, a journalist who was imprisoned for publishing a book on the Gülen movement. Ismail Saymaz, who uncovered the story of Ali Ismail Korkmaz, who was killed by the police during the Gezi protests. And Sami Elvan was with us. He's the father of Berkin Elvan, and today is the second anniversary of Berkin Elvan's death. He was a 15-year-old boy, and he passed away after being in a coma for 269 days because he had a gas canister that hit his head. So also here we'd like to remember him and all the children who have been killed by the Turkish security forces and the police, and we want to remind their families that we stand in solidarity with them. Our speaker tonight, Professor Chomsky, needs no introduction, but I will still say a couple of sentences. He's a world-renowned linguist, cognitive scientist, philosopher, social critic, and activist. He's a professor emeritus here at MIT. He has received numerous awards, recognitions, and honorary degrees all around the world. He's an outspoken critic of neoliberalism, U.S. foreign policies around the world. And he was gracious enough actually to come and speak with us in a Bostonbul event back in October 2013, along with two other professors, Professor Aslı Dızsız and Zeynep Türk Yılmaz. He gave us his analysis of the Gezi protests back then. The title of that event was What's Happening in Turkey. And tonight we're using the same title because Turkey never stops to challenge us. And we will continue to challenge what's happening in Turkey by holding these talks. And in fact, thousands of people continue to challenge the authority in Turkey. The most recent example was the peace petition that was signed by a group of academics declaring that they will not take part in the crimes that are going on in the conflict in the southeastern part of Turkey. And Professor Chomsky was also one of the signatories of that peace petition. According to Human Rights Foundation of Turkey, at least 142 civilians have been killed between August 16 and February 5. These are some estimates, but the violence is escalating, and the war in Syria is affecting Turkey, and obviously the position Turkey is taking in that war is also affecting the region. So without further ado, I would like to leave it to Professor Chomsky for his take on what's happening. The first half will be him speaking to us, and the second half we will take questions. We will do a Q&A session. We do need to pass the microphone for the question to be heard and to be recorded. Thank you.
can you hear me first of all?
Yes.
Yeah. The title that's announced up there is pretty broad, much too broad for me to try to address in these few comments, but feel free to bring up other things later. I'm going to concentrate on Turkey and its immediate impact on the nearby region. I'm sure you've read about the ongoing negotiations between Turkey and the European Union on refugees. The cynicism of this agreement has come under sharp and quite justified criticisms by the human rights organizations and others. But it's important to recognize that the criticism may be a little misleading in one important respect. It may suggest, as much of the discussion tends to do, that this is something new, and it's not. It's a broken record, not just with regard to Turkey, but much more generally. Important to understand, though I'll just keep Turkey here and Europe. One crucial matter has to do with what is called the refugee crisis. Okay, there's a good bit to say about that, but I'll put it aside and pretend, for the sake of discussion, that there is a refugee crisis, though exactly what that means is interesting to look at. Critics have pointed out that in order to obtain Turkish agreement to protect Europe from the so-called refugee crisis, the Europeans have agreed to overlook ongoing and mounting crimes of the Turkish state. These range, as you've heard, from the silencing by force of opposition voices. The most recent case was the takeover of the Zaman Group, main newspaper in Turkey, which was mildly critical of the government after the takeover, is producing predictably government propaganda, from the silencing of opposition voices to the violent and brutal repression that's proceeding in the southeast in the Kurdish areas. And we can add to that something else which deserves some comment, Turkey's intriguing stance with regard to Syria, which is critical to this whole issue. Well, the criticisms are correct, although this is true, but it's quite important to recognize that it's nothing new whatsoever. And in fact, it doesn't even begin to compare, it doesn't come close to comparing to Western complicity in far worse Turkish crimes in the very recent past. In fact, complicity is something of an understatement. More accurately, direct and decisive participation in quite shocking crimes. All of that's important to understand if we want to make sense of current events. I'll keep here to the post-Cold War period. It's a very enlightening period to focus on if we want to understand how foreign policy is designed and implemented. And the reason is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was no longer possible to simply resort to the standard reflexive cold pretext that whatever we're doing is because the Russians are doing. When that pretext dissolved, you can see the essence of foreign policy, its design, motives, implementation, in a much brighter light. So how did the United States react to the end of the Cold War? And how does Turkey fit into that conception? Well, there are actually two dimensions of this question that deserve close attention. One has to do with ideology. What was the ideological reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union? And the second has to do with the fact. what in fact happened. With regard to ideology, it's straightforward and pretty interesting. There was, of course, euphoria about the U.S. victory in this cosmic conflict. I'll simply quote some pretty representative comments from the leading intellectual journals, the New York Review of Books, New York Times. The United States now emerged as the leader, these are quotes, the leader of the enlightened states. For the first time in history, with the Soviet Union gone, the U.S. was able to pursue principles and values for the first time in history. No more impediment. It could proceed on its mission of saving humanity under the guiding hand of an idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity, led by Bill Clinton, whose foreign policy had entered into a noble phase with a saintly glow by 1997, and on like that. Quite a flow of impressive rhetoric. All of this was amplified by a quite remarkable PR campaign to elevate Reagan, who was incidentally never particularly popular, to elevate him to a semi-divine figure, a colossus, quote, whose spirit seems to stride over the country, watching us like a warm and friendly ghost. The kind of words that are rarely heard outside of Pyongyang. In this case, Stanford University institution. Although the swooning went way beyond, and it's almost universal. So Obama and others worship Reagan as a transformative figure of unbelievable magnificence. Well, that's what the ideology was like. What are the facts like? Well, one immediate question, of course, is what happens to the two military pacts, NATO and the Warsaw Pact? It's a pretty obvious question when the Cold War ends. There were actually two visions at the time presented in the discussions on this issue, primarily between Mikhail Gorbachev, representing the Soviet Union, and George Bush, number one, statesman Bush, and James Baker, as Secretary of State on the other side, also Germans and others. Gorbachev's vision was that both military pacts should be dissolved, and that a Eurasian zone of peace should be created, cooperative zone of peace from Lisbon to Vladivostok, with a number of centers in Brussels and Moscow and Ankara, perhaps farther east. The U.S. had a different alternative, namely the Warsaw Pact should be dissolved, of course, and NATO, instead of dissolving, should expand. First, NATO should expand to East Germany. That was actually in violation of verbal promises to Gorbachev. Gorbachev had made quite a remarkable concession. He had agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join a hostile military alliance, NATO. If you look at the history of the preceding century, that's a pretty astonishing concession. Germany alone had practically wiped out Russia several times in the century, killing tens of millions of people, destroying the country repeatedly. And Gorbachev was saying, okay, Germany can be unified and join a military alliance with the United States, which is obviously hostile. He did insist on a quid pro quo, namely that NATO would not expand, the phrase was, 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase. That meant East Germany. Nobody even contemplated anything beyond. And he did receive a promise to that effect from the U.S., which immediately reneged on it and moved NATO to East Germany. Gorbachev, of course, complained, but he was instructed that it was verbal promise. There was nothing on paper, and the implication is if you're stupid enough to believe in a gentleman's agreement with us, what happens is your problem. It wasn't quite expressed that way. After moving to East Germany, NATO under Clinton then expanded right to the Russian border. This was a move that was pretty harshly criticized by many U.S. high-level senior statesmen, George Kennan and others, described the expansion of NATO as, in their words, a tragic mistake and a policy error of historic proportions. We are now seeing the consequences as the expansion continued. By a few years ago, 28 and 2013, NATO officially offered Ukraine the opportunity to join NATO, quite apart from long-standing historical and cultural connections. Most Ukrainian language is Russian. Connection goes way back. But this is the absolute heartland of Russian geostrategic concerns. That no matter who was in charge in Russia, they considered this a really major threat. And the effect we're now seeing, conflict in Ukraine, Crimea, very serious conflict. Both sides, by now, NATO troops are right on the Russian border. First time since the Second World War that possible armies have been at the Russian border. Some memories there about what this meant. Both sides now are expanding their military forces, and the U.S. is quadrupling the NATO mission at the border. Russia is doing the same. They're both taking very provocative acts. NATO, heavily armed NATO forces, U.S. forces are carrying out maneuvers literally hundreds of yards from the Russian border. Russia's acting the same way. If you look at the arms control journals, Arms Control Today, they point out, they warn, in fact, that both sides are acting as if war is thinkable. They're both acting in ways which could escalate up to the point where war would break out. Anyone who has looked at the really shocking record of the history of nuclear weapons since the late 1940s will understand. There's no time to go into it now, but the fact is that if you look at this record, you can see that it's absolutely a miracle that we've survived. We've come very close to nuclear war, and that means terminal war for everyone, many, many times. And in fact, new cases keep being revealed. Just a couple of weeks ago, it was revealed that in 1979, the U.S. automated detection systems, both the U.S. and Russia have automated systems which try to detect oncoming attacks. The U.S. ones are far more sophisticated. U.S. systems are satellite run, which means you can see everywhere, all the way into Russia. The Russian systems are basically radar eyesight run, so they're much more sensitive and surely have nothing like the sophistication of U.S. systems. We know the record in some detail on the U.S. side, and you can be certain that the record on the Russian side must be much worse. Anyway, this is on the U.S. side in one of many cases. In 1979, the U.S. automated systems detected a major missile attack from the Soviet Union. It's taken seriously enough so that it went past the Joint Chiefs of Staff up to the National Security Advisor, speaking of Brzezinski. He was literally on the telephone, ready to call President Carter to instruct him to launch a retaliatory attack, which means the end of the human species, when a message came in saying there was a false alarm. One of hundreds and hundreds of false alarms. The few periods that have been studied They're literally often hundreds a year. On the Russian side, it's got to be much worse. And some of these cases are really mind-boggling. I won't go into. Anyway, that's what we're doing now. Both sides escalating. U.S. rapidly increasing forces. Russians too. Recently, a Russian military plane with its transponder off. The military planes fly both sides with transponders off so they can't be detected. A Russian military plane came within seconds of hitting a Danish commercial jet with killed hundreds of people, and who knows what would have happened after that. These are the kind of things that could easily set off a terminal war. These are direct consequences of the expansion of NATO, which was, as Ken and others said, a tragic mistake of policy error of historic proportions, now especially when it extends to offers to incorporate Ukraine into the NATO system. Well, so one reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union was to extend NATO to Russia's borders. Another was to change NATO's mission, radically change NATO's mission. For the previous years, since its origin, NATO had been presented as a force intended to defend the West from the Russian hordes. No more Russian hordes, so we extend NATO to Russia's borders. And furthermore, its mission was officially extended, to become a worldwide military system with the goal of protecting the global energy system. That means pipelines, sea lanes, that's the world. And also to serve as an intervention force under U.S. command, the U.S. intervention force. And of course, one consequence of the Cold War is that intervention becomes much easier. The deterrent is gone. All that. So those are the two visions. Gorbachev, of course, was rejected. The other one is what was implemented. Turkey remained, as it had been, a crucial NATO outpost, crucial geostrategic position pointing directly into the Middle East, so quite important. With the Cold War over, it was no longer possible to pretend that U.S. and British intervention and violence was in defense against the Russian threat. Now disappeared. And in fact, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Bush 1 administration did come out with a number of policy decisions, a new defense strategy, a new budget, and they're quite interesting. One major point was that the vast military system had to be maintained, but not against the Russians, because they're disappeared, but in order to defend ourselves from the technological sophistication, that's the phrase used, from the technological sophistication of third world countries. We really have to tremble in fear before that, so we need this military system. Second point was that it was necessary to maintain what was called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry. People like us, MIT's right in the center of it, part of the place where the public funds, taxpayer funds, are used to develop the technology, the economy of the future for the benefit of corporate profits. So that's the defense industrial base, and that, of course, has to be maintained. And third, and what is most interesting, had to do with the Middle East. So we have to maintain intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. And then came this interesting phrase, the Middle East, where the major problems we faced could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. So the problems weren't the Russians. Sorry, folks, we've been lying to you for half a century, but now we have to recognize the reality. The clouds have lifted. The problem is, and always was, what's called radical nationalism, meaning independent nationalism that disobeys orders. It's not under control. that's what the problem was. The problems could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. And I have to face these. What about Turkey? Right at this time, Turkey was escalating a vicious counterinsurgency campaign targeting the Kurdish population in the southeast. Much worse than today. No small matter. Maybe 40 or 50,000 people were killed. 3,500 towns and villages were wiped out. Every imaginable kind of torture and terror was taking place. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds, by some estimates millions of Kurds, were driven out of the southeast, refugees, many of them driven to the slums of Istanbul. I happened to be visiting towards the end of this campaign, visited some of the Istanbul slums where you found families living in a room in condemned buildings, unable to go outside because it's crime-ridden, drug-ridden. Some told us that they actually were given permission by the Turkish government to return to their villages and towns, but only on condition that they sign a statement saying that the villages had been destroyed by the PKK, the Kurdish guerrillas, which they knew wasn't true, destroyed by the army. And many of them just refused to sign and continued, and I presume still continue to live under those horrendous circumstances, which incidentally practically nobody in Istanbul seems to know about. These slums are often condemned areas, nobody goes there. That's what was happening at the time. It's a major horror story. So what was the reaction of the enlightened states and the leader of the idealistic New World bent on ending inhumanity to these ongoing horrors in a native country? Straightforward. The U.S. was providing the arms. 80% of the arms to carry out these atrocities were supplied by the Clinton administration, mounting as the atrocities mounted. Turkey, in fact, became the world leader for a recipient of U.S. arms. There's a qualification. There's a separate category, Israel and Egypt. They're off somewhere else. But apart from Israel and Egypt because of Israel. So basically, aside from that, Turkey took the lead in receiving the U.S. arms. In 1997, remember that was the year when Clinton's foreign policy entered into a noble phase with a saintly glow. In that year, Clinton sent more arms to Turkey that single year than the entire Cold War period combined up to the onset of the counterinsurgency. That was the saintly glow. Americans knew very little about this, and for one simple reason, the press refused to report it. Of course, everyone had a bureau in Ankara, New York Times, everyone else, but couldn't find this out. There were some reports. Human Rights Watch was reporting it. John Turman, who now heads the CIS, was reporting it. A couple of other people, Jonathan Randall, but you really had to work to find out about it. Well, that was the saintly glow of the enlightened states. The cynicism about this peaked in an interesting way in 1999. NATO in 1999 had its 50th anniversary. It was a pretty somber anniversary. There was lots of concern about crimes being carried out in the Balkans, which were pretty ugly, but didn't even begin to compare with atrocities that the U.S. was backing all over the world at the same time. But of course, the Balkans are different. The lament was, how can we Europeans tolerate atrocities going on right near the border of Europe? That's hard. On the other hand, it was quite easy to tolerate incomparably worse atrocities going on right within NATO, not on its borders, but within NATO, with the direct, decisive 2000, the Kurdish insurgency had been pretty much suppressed. The Turkish government remained in control, and the arms flow to Turkey, therefore reduced. It was no longer necessary to lead the enlightened states in their noble phase. So Turkey dropped out of first place. Of course, another country had to replace it. It was replaced by Colombia, which had by far the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere, and now moved to first place in receiving arms from the United States. Incidentally, there's actually nothing new about this. We go back to 1980. There was an important study by the leading academic specialist on human rights in Latin America, Lars Schultz. He studied the relation between U.S. aid, including military aid, and what he called egregious human rights violations, and they were pretty egregious, horrendous, in fact. And he found a very close correlation. Academic article, nobody paid any attention. There was another study done at the same time by a friend, a colleague, co-author of mine, Edward Herman, an economist at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He studied the relation between U.S. aid, including military aid, and some of this goes right through the Carter years, U.S. military aid, and improvements in the climate for business operations. So in terms of repatriation of profits and so on and so forth. And there was indeed a very close correlation. But that makes sense. It's understandable that U.S. policy would be directed to improvement in investor rights, business operations, and so on. But there's a second point. How do you improve the climate for business operations? Well, the best way is to murder union leaders, to assassinate human rights activists, to massacre the working people and peasants, chemical warfare in peasant areas. All of this improves enormously the climate for business operations. Therefore, there is a secondary correlation between military aid and human rights violations. It's not that the United States is dedicated to torture and murder. It's just that this is a concomitant of an actual goal, commitment to improving the climate for business operations. And that after the early 80s, nobody even bothered to study this anymore. But during the Reagan years, it was so obvious that a study would have been superfluous. Now I'm talking about what happened in the 90s and later, when it's also superfluous. Well, we're now up to 2000. In the following years, the situation in Turkey did improve, notably improved. There was some recognition of elementary Kurdish rights. There was limited options for Kurds to use their language, quite limited. Before that, it was lethal. And in general, there was a kind of a relaxation of the situation. I visited a couple times, other people visited and seen it as well. There was also improvement, not marvelous, but improvement in the climate for freedom of speech. And quite interestingly, there was the beginning of a willingness to discuss, among the public at least, the question of the Armenian slaughter back a century ago, what many call the Armenian genocide. I was there a couple of years ago as a lecturer. There's a lectureship in honor of Frank Dink, a journalist who was exposing the Turkish atrocities against the Armenians. He was murdered right outside the building where his offices were. There's an annual lectureship. And the day I was there was a huge march through Istanbul, so big that the police didn't try to control it, supporting exposure of the atrocities in honor of Frank Dink. It ended right in front of the building, publisher where he was, and actions took place as well. So, for example, in Diyarbakir in the southeast, sort of Kurdish capital, in the year 2000, I asked to see the Armenian church. There was an Armenian church, big Armenian church. I asked if I could see it. They kind of reluctantly took me over. It was a total wreck, falling apart, the roof falling, and so on. I then asked to see if there had been anyone who collected any relics from the church. And I was taken to a small store nearby where an old Armenian man had collected some relics. That was 2000. A couple of years later, Turkish groups in Istanbul began a campaign to rebuild the church, reconstruct it. And apparently, I haven't seen it, but apparently it's been rebuilt. There's all of these were beginnings of indications of real improvements to the climate in Turkey. It was pretty impressive. And that was up till about 10 years ago. Then it switched. The Erdogan government has continually become authoritarian. Turkey quickly gained the first record in the world for repression of journalists. It's now getting much worse, as we heard. But bad as it is, and it's bad enough, it's worth bearing in mind that it is nothing like what happened very recently with decisive U.S., also European support. So the current cynicism, while real, is just a pale shadow of what has happened before, and possibly a portent of what's coming. All of this is recent, and it's in the back of everyone's mind. Well, the curfews now in the southeast have reached, in some areas, 100 days. There are many deaths, people afraid to go out of their homes because of sniper attacks, heavy military equipment in the streets. We don't know much about what's happening, as you just heard, and partly because human rights investigators and lawyers are just banned. So you can only get, as you heard from the comments, phone calls and so on. There are individual cases which give some of the picture. There's some cases. Amnesty International just released a couple of weeks ago a chilling report on the oppression. One example, they write that in a telling example of how little tolerance the authorities have for any form of dissent regarding the operations, on the 9th of January, state prosecutors initiated a criminal investigation for making, the official charge was making propaganda for a terrorist organization. It was issued against a chat show host. The investigation was launched after a caller to the show said that mothers and children were being killed in the southeast and urged people not to stay silent about it. The chat show host thanked and applauded her for her contribution, saying he supported her call for peace. There was a media furor, death threats against those involved, investigation against the chat show host, the head of the television program, and the caller followed. That's the nature, illustrates the oppression. Just mention one more case. One of the most outrageous cases is the attack on Seven Nisanyan, who's in prison, been in prison for 2 years, over 2 years. He's right now facing a likely 25-year sentence. His crime is that he has been devoted completely selflessly for years to saving old villages, building houses, planting vegetation, creating jobs, creating environmental sanctuaries in a really saint-like manner. And in opposing zoning laws, he once broke seals placed by the authorities. That's the crime. He'll be in jail for the rest of his life if there's no substantial protest. But individual cases, and there are plenty of them, that barely hint at the severity of the repression, the attack on free expression, the bitter attack on the Kurdish population of the southeast, which can hardly fail to elicit grim memories of what happened not many years ago. All of this is connected to what's going on in the neighboring regions of Iraq and Syria. The major ground forces combating ISIS, so-called Islamic State, in both countries Kurdistan, they're the ones who prevented ISIS from conquering Iraqi Kurdistan when they were on the march. They're the ones who saved the remnants of the Yazidis from total destruction at the hands of ISIS. In Syria, they're the ground forces protecting the Kurds, holding back ISIS, moving into ISIS territory. And meanwhile, quite amazingly, they're apparently developing a remarkably decent society in Syria, considering the circumstances. And they are the primary enemies of Turkey. Turkey's actions in both countries are primarily directed against these forces. PKK is also on the U.S. terrorist list. Meanwhile, the point is that Turkey simply does not want an autonomous Kurdish area anywhere near its border because of its own repression and control of its Kurdish regions inside. Most of the Kurds in the world are in Turkey. Meanwhile, Turkey is giving tacit support for ISIS, not very secretly. It's providing a funnel for jihadis to move into the Islamic State areas, allowing commerce out of them, for oil and so on. It's at the same time quite openly supporting the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, the Nusra Front, which, like ISIS, is excluded from international negotiations as a terrorist force of radical Islamists. It's also incidentally supported by U.S. allies, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in this convoluted Syrian tragedy. And in all of this disgraceful tragedy, Erdogan has a very strong card to play, and he's playing it. He can exploit Europe's miserable reaction to the so-called refugee crisis, as he's now doing in the ongoing European Union-Turkey negotiations. But we should bear in mind that we're hardly in a position to criticize it. The U.S. is much worse, taking no Syrian refugees. We have to be very cautious here. Some Syrian doctor might be a terrorist in disguise. You know about that. This is the safest country in the world and also the most frightened that goes way back in American history. And much worse than that is what we're doing with regard to Central America. The refugees from Central America are fleeing from U.S. terror and violence. We destroy their countries, they flee, we then send them back. We pressure Mexico to do exactly what the European Union is doing with regard to Turkey, to keep them away from our borders. Of course, Mexicans are fleeing too. Largely also our victims, many of them victims of NAFTA, which predictably wiped out Mexican agriculture. The Mexican campesinos can be quite efficient, but they can't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness and what are called free trade agreements. So when you wreck the place, you then keep them away. I'll put aside the racist ravings of Trump and others. But all in all, it's not a very attractive picture of the enlightened states and the idealistic new world bent on inhumanity. And it's a picture that we have it in our power to change, and something that we better do so and fast. Thanks.
Chomsky. I am a teacher, and I teach here in the I teach here in the U.S., but I also develop curriculum for many countries internationally. And so many of the atrocities you're talking about occur, I think, because governments can work in this sort of safe harbor of public uninformation. I'm curious what you would think the role of educating, and specifically educating young people, both here in America and internationally, would be in order to improve public awareness and put more pressure on these governments to prevent them from creating these sort of atrocities.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Here in the U.S. Depends what we want our children to be. Should they be passive, obedient slaves of state propaganda, or should they be citizens of a functioning democratic society who have enough understanding of the world to participate in decisions that are morally justified and factually and empirically feasible? That's a choice. And if we, that's a question about the educational system. In fact, for the United States, a kind of a deeper question is, do we want our children even to know that the world exists? The United States is a remarkably insular society. Many people know almost nothing about the outside world. It's astonishing. And it's kind of understandable. And if you're a European, if you travel 100 miles, you hear a different language, you hear a different culture, you see mementos from earlier centuries, a rich cultural tradition. In the United States, if you go from Boston to Los Angeles, you might as well be in the same place. The weather's a little different. The stories are the same, people are the same, slightly different accent. And it's a rich, closed society. You don't have to go very far away. You can stay inside if you want. So the end result is it's just extremely interesting. I mean, sometimes astonishing piece of things. So the question is, do we want our children to understand that there's a world? Do we want them to understand that the U.S. plays a decisive, crucial role in the world because of its enormous wealth and power? Do we want them to know what the actions are that they share responsibility for? Do we want them to know how the world looks at us? Let me give you a concrete example. There are regular polls taken of international opinion by major U.S. polling agencies, Gallup polls, major U.S. polling agencies. They ask all sorts of questions. But one of the questions they ask is, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? And who do you think wins? The United States is in the lead by a huge margin. There's nobody else even close. And second place, way below, is Pakistan. And that's primarily because of the Indian vote. If you ask in the United States, what's the greatest threat to world peace? The answer you get typically is Iran. Not in the world. Do Americans know anything about this? No, they can't. The press literally refuses to report it. Refuses. It's not that they don't know. This is a Gallup poll, after all. Many polls have reported, but not this. So do we want Americans to know something about what the world thinks? Well, those are the questions about what kind of educational system we want. Not just schools, also the information system, universities, media, and so on.
May I? Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation of Bostonbul. You gave us a lot of for thought on a subject and a title that was maybe a little broad, like you said, but I'm going to ask you 3 very specific questions. I listened to you very carefully. You talked about 1999 in Turkey and how somehow the armed shipments, the crazy armed shipments from the U.S. were lessening, but you did not mention something very important, and that was the capture of Bostonbul. That was 1999, and I wonder if what your comment is, that probably for the Turkish state was the reason why maybe the stakes were not as high, because things kind of changed in the next following years. The second one I couldn't help but notice, but you mentioned 1915 and you said the slaughter of Armenians. That was your words. And then later you said what made all the Armenian genocide. I'm just curious to know if you would like to call it by its name, the Armenian genocide or not. The third one is Sevan Nishanian. Obviously a pathetic situation. However, I do want to ask you, would you say that that is a very horrible example of authoritarianism by the Turkish state? Because 2 options. 1, because the sentence is extremely harsh, or is it because Sevan Nishanian should have been allowed to actually go against zoning laws, something that some people may think should have been preserved? Thank you.
If the translation is correct. The first question was about the capture of Öcalan. He was the titular leader of the PKK. He was captured, imprisoned. He's been in prison ever since then. I think it was 1999. I'm not sure exactly what the question is about. That's what happened. That's part of the ongoing struggle between Turkey and its Kurdish population. Since then, Öcalan has changed his positions quite a lot while in prison. He's, for one thing, called for peace negotiations and reduced the claims, the PKK claims, to calls for a kind of some level of autonomy within Turkey rather than independent Kurdistan. And he's the one who he's still regarded as basically the leader by the Kurdish populations in the PKK and the YPG, both Syrian and Kurdish. And his advocacy of women's rights, democratic society, cooperative communities, borrowing a lot from Mary Bookchin and American anarchists, has apparently influenced significantly the actions being taken in Syria by the relatively independent Kurdish populations there. I'm not sure if that's what your question was directed to.
No, but I don't want to take time away from you.
Let's
go to the second.
Okay. Was this, should be what I call the slaughter, sometimes called genocide of the Armenians, should it be called genocide? Actually, I don't use the word genocide anymore. The word genocide has been so vulgarized and trivialized for political reasons that I think the term is no longer usable. So I simply don't use it, even for cases that are quite plausible by old former usage to plausibly be called genocide. East Timor, where maybe a third or a quarter of the population was wiped out. And so with U.S. support, per capita slaughter that wins the championship. And many call it genocide. I've been very much involved in that cause for many years, but I've never called it genocide, maybe virtual genocide. I think the term has just been destroyed by vulgarization and politically directed use. So just a personal choice, but it's plausible to call it genocide if other things. If you use the term genocide seriously in something like its originally intended sense, yeah, but not in the current vulgarized sense, I feel. About what's the question was, am I speaking about the crime or the sentencing? Well, the crime was breaking a seal in the course of environmental protection activities. So yes, that's a crime. Maybe you get 2 days of community service. It's getting 25 years. You decide what the crime is.
Professor Chomsky, first of all, I'm with New England British Association. We are a British organization based here in New England. And as a British activist, I would like to say thank you for everything you have done with the Kurds. Kurds live in a very rough neighborhood in the Middle East, and there are a lot of abuses, as you have told us this evening. You have been a great help. You have been a great voice of conscience for the Kurds, and for that we are very much grateful for that voice. And as we would say in Kurdish, zor spas namustar, I have 3 questions, and the questions are basically for the first one. You just mentioned in 1990s that's human rights violations. In 1990s, during the era, basically 4,000 Kurdish villages were burned in Turkey by our weapons here in America. Basically, the word cobra was one of the most common words used among the Kurdish population in the villages that didn't understand Turkish or any English. But the word cobra was one of the most common words because cobra helicopters burned the villages. And 17,000 people went missing, 2.5 million people become internal refugees. And at that time, we as British activists in America, we struggled trying to raise the awareness of what's happening to the British population in Turkey. Unfortunately, now we see a similar situation happening again in Cizre, in Slopi, in Kelbora, in many different Kurdish cities and towns. And you see the Kurdish men line up against the wall in Diyarbakir, the biggest Kurdish city in Turkey. It's like seems you would think that this is from ISIS-controlled territories of Syria. And international community again turns deaf ears to the Kurdish drama that is happening in Turkey. And Turkey, as you mentioned, is a NATO country. And despite that, we are not seeing the NATO allies, NATO members, NATO friends telling their friend Turkey to stop killing, massacring its Kurdish population. And for the question in this regard to this is what we as British activists, what would you recommend for us to raise awareness to our fellow Americans so that they can help us to put a pressure on Turkey so that this could be stopped? That is the first question. Second the second question is this is in regards to what Turkey's relationship with Syria. Basically, the conflict in Syria mainly get to the level where it is today. Turkey has a big role in it. Those of us are familiar with the region know very well that Turkey has led the European jihadists around the world, pass through the border, look like they're going to vacation.
Let's keep it shorter.
Sure. And for this, so that again, there's a lot of list of things happened. Turkey has been doing in recent memory for 3, 4, 5 years with conflict in Syria, and we all know about it. The people that have any interest in Turkey, they know about it. The question is, nobody did anything about it except either today or yesterday. I remember reading an article in Washington Post where 2 former ambassadors to Turkey, Ambassador Edelman and Ambassador Abrams, are saying is that basically it's about time for everyone to go. My question in regards to this, why do you think the timing is now, not last year, the year before, all these things happen, why it is now? And the third question, very simple, and that is, what would you say is Mr. Öcalan's role in the peace process in Turkey? Do you see a day that Mr. Öcalan play a role in the peace process in Turkey like Nelson Mandela did in South Africa? Thank you, and sorry everyone for the long questions.
Incidentally, could you hear?
The second question is convoluted answers. The first question is what do you recommend the Kurdish community here to do to put pressure on the Americans to stop what's going on?
Okay, well, my question, I couldn't hear it. Here's what was transmitted. What should Öcalan's role be in the negotiations, peace process? Well, as far as the Kurds are concerned, he's their spokesman. So he obviously has to play a major role in the peace negotiations. Also, he's been, whatever one thinks about his past, debated, he's been, in recent years, taking a pretty constructive position, I think, both with regard to the peace negotiations and also with regard to social policy. So I think that's the second reason why he should certainly be given a major role in the peace negotiations, and in my view, he shouldn't be in prison either. I think that's so that I don't see much debatable about that, really. If there's going to be any kind of a peace settlement, he'll obviously have to play a major role, and should. As far as the Kurdish community here is concerned, well, they should be in the forefront of trying to carry out the badly needed educational process of getting Americans to understand what's going on. You can't put pressure on the American government to change policy unless people know what the policy is. Now, right now, it's not the United States that's in the forefront of supporting Turkish repression. It does indirectly by not criticizing it. And it shouldn't be doing it. I mean, you shouldn't just hear this from Human Rights Watch. This should be coming from the government. There is, in fact, just today, a call from the Kurdish Human Rights Group in London, which is the main international Kurdish rights group, call to get the NATO powers to expel Turkey from NATO. Okay, that's whatever one thinks of that as a tactic. The background for understanding this has to be understood by the populations of the United States and Europe if there's going to be any constructive action. In the 1990s, it was really scandalous. There was literally virtually no information, almost nothing. And there were real horror stories going on, decisively supported by the United States, and people simply didn't know, so it was impossible to build up any purpose. That's, and Kurds here who are in close connection, way more than I do about what's going on. They should be working hard to spread the word, organize, carry out protests, organize meetings like this, and so on. And there's a lot that can be done.
Okay, just one question, please, and try to keep it brief so we can get as many questions as
And
possible.
whoever's doing the Periscope live stream, reboot it because there's a 20-minute limit and it's not any longer streaming live.
So my question is going to be about our mistake. I'm here. What is our mistake is the question. So since 1990s, there is an anti-neoliberal movement in this world. We can start it from Zapatistas in Mexico or from the 1999 Seattle protests. During the 2000s, there was this World Social Forum and the European Social Forum. There was a huge anti-war movement. And in 2010, during the 2010s, people went to streets and took the streets, occupied the squares in Spain, in Greece, in Turkey, in Tahrir, in Egypt, and also in US with the Occupy Wall Street movement. And there's this Black Lives Matter movement, but they're all appearing and then disappearing. And they cannot transform to a political movement that can change the societies. So what is our mistake? What do you think about this?
The movements that you mentioned have all been very important, and I think they reflect a vast amount of public opinion. So what are we not doing right? We're not turning them into ongoing, unified, continuing social movements. Actually, there's a very live example right now. The Sanders campaign is creating mobilizing a lot of people, a lot of enthusiasm, mostly young people. And it has an opportunity which it could grasp now or might lose. This is an important moment. Will it use the momentum to create the basis for organization which will outlast the election? There's a regular process here, it's been going on for years. We have something, kind of an extravaganza that goes on every 4 years, electoral extravaganza. And the propaganda system says that's what you focus on. And then when it's over, you go home and forget everything. That happens over and over. Quite often, a lot of enthusiasm is built up for the campaign, like, say, the Obama campaign, a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. It was misplaced, but whatever you think about it, it was there. It disappeared as soon as the election took place. In fact, Obama tried to turn it into an organization that would support his policies. What it should have been is an organization that would oppose his policies. But anyway, it dissolved. The same thing happened with the Rainbow Coalition. It happens over and over. That's part of the pretense that what matters for social change and for social policy is the electoral extravaganza. I mean, it's not totally insignificant, but it's a minor part of bringing about the kinds of changes in policies that are desperately needed. But of course, propaganda just focuses on that. So you push the button and go home and be a nice, passive citizen. So the question now is, well, in the ongoing Sanders campaign, can steps be taken now, not after November, now, to turn it into a movement which is going to continue, and it will continue to pursue the kinds of programs and policies that are desperately needed, typically in opposition to what the government will do for good reasons, because the government answers to different interests and different pressures. That's the live question now, and I think that's the immediate question which will give the response to your question.
Hi, Professor. It was an honor to listen to you this evening. I, along with my friends, traveled from Albany to listen to you. My question is specifically not about the Middle East, but about a similar policy of the United States adopted towards Indian policy in the Indian-occupied Kashmir. In Kashmir for 30 years now, as you know, there have been tremendous violation of human rights, and the world seems absolutely silent about it. So my question specifically is that, with the growing intolerance in India, having right-wing government at the center, with the cases of lynching of Muslims for eating beef, with the charges of sedition being pressed against a student activist who was actually talking about the judicial murder of a Kashmiri freedom fighter, what can the United States' role or why has the United States been so silent about what's going on in Kashmir for 3 decades now? I am a Kashmiri and I have really gone through all of that. Thank you very much.
Kashmir is a... You want to talk about that? We have here a journalist who's barred from India because he dared to talk about Kashmir, which is There it is. David Barsami.
Hello. Kashmir is probably the most underreported tragedy in the world today. Since the uprising began in 1989, tens of thousands of Kashmiris have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been imprisoned, tortured, treated in the most abominable ways imaginable. And this is all being done by the world's largest democracy, which obviously fears someone like me, and thus I'm banned from traveling to India because it is, I'm considered a threat to national security. So this is an issue that has been smoldering for decades since the partition of 1947. Under very murky circumstances, a Muslim-majority state had a Hindu Maharaja who supposedly signed a piece of paper that now has gone missing, incidentally. No one seems to find this document that the Indian state keeps referring to legitimize its rule. It's a complicated situation. All situations are complicated, but Nehru, at the time, the Prime Minister, promised the international community that there would be a plebiscite to honor the wishes of the Kashmiri people if they wanted to join Pakistan, if they wanted to be independent, or whether they wanted to stay with India. That was quickly forgotten and buried in the dustbin of history, and the Indian state has cemented its grip on Kashmir. It is probably the most densely militarized zone in the world, but also India has been very skillful in its propaganda campaign here in the United States and in Europe. So many people, when you mention India, think of yoga and vegetarianism and Gandhi and Buddha and sitar music and ragas and Ravi Shankar and all these wonderful things which exist in India. But this story and other stories of repression are completely buried, and it's going to require an intrepid journalist to go there and to expose what is going on by the Indian state. So, thanks.
Two last questions were taken, and I think it was already here.
Hello, my name is Raquel. I ask really short questions. So. And I'm a recent graduate in cultural anthropology, and my brother, he got a master's in history of international relations. So we just had a quick question. I'm happy to be here too. So first question is, when in your view is Euro-American intervention justified? And what role should the U.S. play in maintaining peace around the world? One question. And the second question is, who has the better long-term strategy with Syria? The U.S., Russia, or Assad himself?
the world. Well, as far as the second things, it's not easy to think of, first of all, nobody has a decent policy for Syria. nobody that I can think of. Assad is a hideous mass murderer. The Russian intervention, like any violent interventions, don't make things worse. For the United States, it's even hard to determine what the policy is. And our allies, say our Turkish ally, one of our main allies, is supporting the Al-Qaeda affiliate openly and the Islamic State tacitly. The support for the Al-Qaeda affiliate is pretty remarkable. You may remember a couple of months ago, the Pentagon announced that after having spent, who knows how many billions of dollars in training so-called moderate Syrians, 50 of them were being sent to Syria to fight. They landed in Syria. They were immediately annihilated by the al-Nusra Front, Turkey's associate, or else just, defected and went home and left their weapons. Turns out that Turkey was actually notified their Al-Qaeda affiliate that the U.S. training forces were coming. Meanwhile, the United States is giving assistance to the Syrian Kurds who are under attack by Turkey. And their branch in Iraq, PKK, is on the U.S. terrorist list. So it can't get support, even though they're the ones who are fighting off ISIS and Yazidi and so on. Meanwhile, other U.S. allies, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, are supporting the Al-Qaeda affiliate. Russia supporting Assad. They're also monstrous. It's hard to compare them. But it's the only slim, serious, which was, really the center of Arab culture and history for actually thousands of years, is just entering into suicide, literal suicide, being destroyed. There's a slim hope, and that is that somehow there will be ceasefires and local, maybe general, and some kind of peace negotiation. And it's actually beginning to move forward a little. The ceasefire that was announced, the international one, is partially holding, and it's cutting down the number of casualties for the first time in a long time. If that opening can be extended and pursued, and if the U.S. will agree to allow all the relevant powers in, including Iran, crucially, then maybe there's some hope for Syria. It's hard to think of anything else. It's a real awful situation. As far as the U.S. role is concerned, I think we can issue platitudes like it should be to make things better. But the real question is, what do you do in particular circumstances? You have to take a look at particular cases and ask what should we be doing there. So, for example, what should we be doing with regard to Central America? Okay. Central America, the United States, it goes back for years, but we've turned it into a torture chamber. All kinds of 1980s mass murder, slaughter, something like close to genocide in the Mayan Highlands. What should we be doing about it? I think massive reparations and take the refugees who are fleeing from there, but they don't want to come to the United States. They'd much prefer to live in their own countries. If it's possible, good, let's make it possible. Instead of building walls, let's make it possible for them to do what they have every right to do, live decent lives in their own countries, which we destroyed. That's one case. And you can go, have to look at the individual cases. There's no general principle except principles so abstract that they don't really mean much.
This is the last question, I'm sorry.
Chomsky, the Russian campaign. Speak up.
Microphone, please.
Mr. Chomsky, the Russian campaign.
Microphone.
With the Russian intervention in Syria, are we witnessing a new redefining of the borders in the Middle East?
Well, the question of the borders in the Middle East is a very important one. The borders in the Middle East are imperial imposed borders, which had nothing to do with the interests of the population. Same in Africa, the same all over the world where the European plague spread. The borders are designed for the interests of the imperial powers. They're meaningless. I mean, I actually experienced this myself 60 years ago when I happened to be living in Israel as a student, backpacking up in the north. And a Jeep came along on a road behind me, and a guy got out and started yelling to me and said, come back, you're in the wrong country. I crossed into Lebanon. The border, I mean, by now it's bristle, armaments and so on. And none of these borders mean anything to the populations. In Afghanistan, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Durand Line, was imposed by the British for their own interest in controlling India. Splits the Pashtun areas in half. They've never accepted it. In fact, no Afghan government's ever accepted it. But when Pashtun villagers cross the border, when they call terrorists and kill them with drones, maybe they're visiting their cousin or something like that. But the U.S.-Mexico border, of course, established by conquest, was a pretty open border until 3 years ago. People would cross it. People, similar people, families on both sides would visit. This goes all around the world. Well, what about the borders in the Middle East? They were imposed in the famous Sykes-Picot Treaty, Britain and France, for their own interests, carved up the region the way they wanted. Nothing to do with the people. It's all over the world. You take a look at the major conflicts going on, Africa, Middle East, and so on. Most of them have to do with the borders that were imposed by European imperialism. And they have no legitimacy. And it's pretty well known. One of the actions that ISIS carried out that made them pretty popular was one of their first videos was a video showing bulldozers knocking down the barrier between Iraq and Syria, designed by the British for their interests. So what should happen to these borders? I think they should erode. And it can be done. In fact, something similar has happened in Europe. It's worth remembering that for centuries, Europe was absolutely the most savage place in the world. The Europeans, their main goal was to slaughter each other. So the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, probably a third of the population of Germany was wiped out. And it went on right through the horrible 20th century. Since 1945, it changed. And not because of any kind of new angelic discovery. It's just that Europeans realized that the next time they play this game, they're going to wipe out everything. So therefore, okay, they figured the game's over. Now we'll start to try to set up something rational. And the Schengen Agreement, which allows free movement inside the European Union, is a major step forward. It's now under threat because of the awful reaction, miserable, disgraceful reaction of the refugees. But it was an important step forward. And it shows that it can be done. And it should be done, I think, in the Middle East.